ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
In November 2011, Australian SAS soldier Ben Roberts-Smith was invited to Buckingham Palace to meet with the Queen. Ben Roberts-Smith had been awarded the Victoria Cross and the Medal for Gallantry and was hailed as a war hero for his service in Afghanistan. And there was something slightly fairy tale-like about the scene. Ben Roberts-Smith is a giant of a man, and he made everything around him, including the tiny Queen, look like it was in miniature. The following year, he was redeployed to Afghanistan, and it was at that time that the higher-ups in the Australian Defence Force began to hear troubling stories about some elements within the SAS. And so the ADF launched a low-key inquiry into the culture of the SAS, and a copy of that report eventually came into the possession of two investigative journalists, Chris Masters and Nick McKenzie. And this was the start of their long and harrowing investigation into allegations surrounding Ben Roberts-Smith. Nick McKenzie spoke to other SAS soldiers who'd been horrified and disgusted by what they'd seen. These killings that they'd witnessed were not accidental shootings of civilians in the fog of war. They witnessed acts of cold-blooded murder of civilians and initiation of other soldiers into murder. Nick McKenzie knew it would be a hell of a thing to publish such allegations about a man lionised as a war hero, a man with rich and powerful friends. Ben Roberts-Smith launched a defamation action. But SAS eyewitnesses came forward to verify the allegations, and the federal court found that Fairfax Media had proven the substantial truth of their stories. And on that day, Nick McKenzie said the court had found that a man who was put on a pedestal as the noble image of a soldier at war is a liar and a war criminal. Nick McKenzie has written a book about this investigation called Crossing the Line. Hello, Nick.
Great to be with you.
This starts with you being contacted by Chris Masters, veteran reporter, who's been on this program, the man who did the classic investigation into the Moonlight State for Four Corners. How did Chris bring you in on this story?
So Chris invites me to the RACV club in Sydney. It's this ancient building, stuck in time. No one's there. Me and Chris, there is a waiter sort of drifting around very quietly, and Chris is quietly seething about the fact that in one of his books about Afghanistan, he hasn't been allowed to talk about Ben Roberts-Smith, this very famous soldier, in the way that he felt was the truth. And he's saying there's things out there, Nick, there's whispers, there's rumours, and I haven't been able to get to the bottom of it, but it needs to be got to the bottom of. And Chris gives me some documents, and I have this strong memory of looking at these documents in the cab flying back to the airport. And there was this classified report detailing this conduct by the SAS in Afghanistan, and the words in that report were shocking. It was talking about alleged executions, brazen misconduct, the abandonment of not just the rules and laws of war, but of basic morality. And I mean, that was a starting point. That report was about broad misconduct, not naming any one soldier. But Chris had indicated there were concerns that it was this one soldier, Ben Roberts-Smith, who was at the heart of this. So our investigation really begun straight away.
And who was the author of this report?
The author of the report was Samantha Cromford, who is a really unusual and brave woman, a sociologist who was running a company in Canberra, and she'd be brought in by Defence, top brass, basically Angus Campbell, who went on to lead the Defence Force. He knew he had some major problems in the ADF, and treatment of women, alcoholism, racism. Where there's a problem and where he knew his own senior command wouldn't have the guts to stand up to it, they couldn't because they'd blow up their careers, he'd bring in Samantha, and she would get to work finding what the problem was, describing it in terms that required action. She'd deliver her a grenade onto his desk, and it would give him the ability to go and clean up. Now, in this case, this wasn't a grenade, it was a mega bomb. She was there to look at the culture of the Special Forces and some of the ways that it was interacting with things like ASIS, our secret service, or other bodies, but she ended up finding these really grave allegations of war crimes, and she laid that ticking bomb on Angus Campbell's desk, who was then Chief of Army, and he had to act, and he did. And ultimately we have this second inquiry commissioned led by this very conservative, quietly spoken senior judge who's also a major general, and he's tasked to go and find out, okay, is it true? There's lots of rumours about war crimes in the special forces in Afghanistan. Are these rumours true? And His Honour Justice Brereton goes and starts very quietly digging away.
So you were reading the Cromford's report that was labelled classified. Who did you start talking to once you read this report?
Well, the obvious place to start was with the SAS soldiers themselves, those who'd been to Afghanistan, who'd served in battle alongside Ben Roberts-Smith. And Chris and I put our heads together. The only way to speak to these guys was going to be face-to-face. Mostly they're based over in Perth, where their headquarters are, but they're also in different commands around the country. So trips to Canberra, Sydney, but most importantly to Perth.
And were these off the record or on the record conversations?
All off the record.
All off the record.
Yeah, you're hoping that they're going to show up in the pub or a coffee shop. And what we found very quickly was there were guys with really strong moral consciences who wanted to talk about what was going on. It was burning within them. It had been burning for years. And not just rocking up in pubs. We had a couple of guys say, come over to the house, meet the wife and the kids, and I'll cook you a lamb, and I want to tell you about what happened in Afghanistan. And I want to tell you about who Ben Roberts-Smith really is.
Were you sceptical of some of these stories initially?
Listen, there was a real decency and genuineness with our SAS sources, and these were considered thoughtful, sometimes veteran war operators. But some of the allegations about Ben Roberts-Smith were, of course, far-fetched. I mean, the most striking one, and if it hadn't been proven by multiple courts and relayed to me by multiple sources, I wouldn't believe it today, that he kicked an unarmed civilian off a cliff. So Ben Roberts-Smith kicked a man off a cliff. You hear that, you say, that's no way that is true. That's a rumour. That's some whispers that have gone out of hand. That can't be true.
So that was one of the stories you heard about his involvement in that incident that was in 2012 at a village called Darwan in Afghanistan. Why was his unit in Darwan that day?
A short time before, there'd been the most awful of incidents where a Afghan National Army soldier, so an ally of the Australians, seconded with the Western forces. He was actually a Taliban plant. He was a terrorist in disguise. He turned his weapon on base onto 3 Australians and murdered them in cold blood, and then fled the Australian base. And it became the most pressing mission for Australian forces to find this guy Hekmatullah and to bring him to justice. Who better to do that than the most highly trained warfighters that Australia has, the SAS? So they were dispatched to find Hekmatullah. They got word that Hekmatullah was passing through this small village in southern Afghanistan called Darwan and may have been holding up there with some Taliban sympathisers, was perhaps travelling on a motorbike. And so the SAS head to Darwan to find Hekmatullah or find those who've been giving him safe harbour. They don't find him, though. He's not there. If he ever was there, he's long ago left. There are Taliban in the village, but there's also civilians in the village who are, of course, suppressed by the Taliban. And this is where Ben Roberts-Smith happens upon Ali Jan. He's one of the young men who are arrested. Any fighting age male, that's any person old enough to pick up a gun, is handcuffed with the plastic cuffs and taken for interrogation. A brief questioning through an SAS translator. Are you Taliban? Do you know Hekmatullah? And he was one of those men.
Who was Ali Jan and why was he in the village that day?
Ali Jan lived in a small village a day's donkey ride away. He had family in the village of Darwan. He was coming there to mill some flour, to collect some firewood and some shoes for his youngest daughter. It was an overnight stay because of the long donkey ride to get to town, but it was a shopping trip. It just happened, it was the shopping trip at the wrong time because when he woke up after collecting his goods that morning, the SAS had swooped into Darwan and their mission had commenced. And Ali Jan had a choice to make. Does he flee back to his village? Does he hang around? He tried to get going fast, which may have drawn suspicion. But at any rate, he was arrested along with dozens of other young men and put into a room for interrogation.
What did these SAS eyewitnesses say happened then during this interrogation?
The most important SAS eyewitness was actually Ben Roberts-Smith's 2IC, second in command, his best mate. This is a guy, a witness who had gone to battle with Ben Roberts-Smith, been highly decorated with Ben Roberts-Smith. He'd fought in the mud with Ben Robert Smith. And he'd done some terrible things on Ben Robert Smith's orders. But on this day, in his mind, Ben Robert Smith went too far. He saw a civilian in Ali Jan, handcuffed and unarmed. He saw the donkey. I think he put it together, this guy is an innocent. But at any rate, he wasn't armed and he was handcuffed. And he saw Ben Robert Smith engage with this guy. The interrogation takes place. Ali Jan denies that he's a member of the Taliban. But really what he sees that so disturbs this second in charge is Ali Jan being led to the edge of a small cliff. And he sees Ben Robert Smith take a few steps backwards. And the second in charge sees Ben Robert Smith kick Ali Jan with great force over that cliff edge. And the second in command then sees Ali Jan come down that cliff and his head strike a rock on the way down. He describes teeth and blood spraying, and it's visceral, but that's what he sees. And it's important to say what he sees because that's that vision that stays in his head. Over and over again, it becomes a trauma burned into his brain. The second in charge, Ben Robert Smith 2IC, says Robert Smith orders him and a second soldier to drag a still alive Ali Jan to under a small scrub. He's in, no doubt, great pain. He's bleeding, he's bloodied, but he's alive. You know, and here's a man no doubt thinking, will I stay alive with a few broken bones or am I finished? Ben Robert Smith gives the order to the second in charge and another soldier to execute Ali Jan. The 2IC by that stage is so horrified, he does not want to be the man who pulls the trigger. So he looks away, he hears a machine gun burst, he turns back and he sees a dead Ali Jan and his comrade holding his weapon up, still at shoulder level. And we know from villages what happens next, and that is that Ali Jan's family come and they dust his face off and he's covered in blood and dust, and they tend to the body of their brother, their uncle, their relative, and they get word back to the village where Ali Jan comes from, and his wife, Bibi Dorko, she's got to try to make the journey to Darwan. And not only does that scene stay in the 2IC of Robert Smith's head, it stays in those villagers' heads because they've seen war, they've seen death at a scale that most Australians couldn't imagine. But it's not often you see your uncle, your brother, your friend kicked off a cliff.
What did the 2IC say had prompted Ben Robert Smith to kick Ali Jan off the cliff?
It wasn't just him, but other testimony corroborated that it was a smile because Ali Jan smiled at him, annoyed him. It was a smirk. It was Ali Jan acting, I guess, Ben Robert Smith's thought with insolence. You're not respecting me. Now, was it a lost in translation? Was Ali Jan, why was he smiling? Was he nervous? Was he irritated at being asked repeatedly, are you teller? Who knows why he's... But a smile, is that a crime to smile? But it was that act of insolence which seems to have set Robert Smith into a rage.
What did they say Ben Robert Smith did after Ali Jan was executed?
The cover-up begins almost immediately. We know from SAS witness testimony that on the helicopter ride back to base and subsequently a story is concocted. The mission reports contain that false story, and basically Ali Jan is said to be an insurgent who is moving through a cornfield, possibly armed, possibly causing a threat to the SAS, and he's shot properly, lawfully, within the rules and laws of armed conflict. Put simply, he's a bad guy who's been dispensed. Good work by the SAS. If one read that report, that's what they would have thought. That was the cover-up that Robert Smith perpetrated.
They said that he put a radio on his body as well, which is one of the things regarded by the forces at the time as indicating that they were probable Taliban. But Ben Robert Smith's colleagues said that they saw him place that on the body. This was called a throwdown?
There was two types of throwdowns. There were radios that could be used to call it an ambush, or there was the pistol, the magic Markov, a Russian-designed pistol. And it was common for those engaged in war crimes to carry either the radio or the spare pistol to plant on the body of those that they executed. Justice Burton found this in his report. In this case, in the case of Ali Jan, there was a radio planted on the body. Where'd that radio come from? It's a really interesting story. Robert Smith waded earlier that day over a river and shot dead a suspected Taliban. Robert Smith was the only person who waded over that river was the radio from that man, which Robert Smith retrieved, taken back over the river and placed on the body. That was the witness testimony of one of the SAS witnesses. He thought that Robert Smith had got the radio from the dead person he'd killed earlier and placed it on Ali Jan. Another critical point, though, that I think for me was Robert Smith was the only soldier wet from the waist down. And the villagers, in recounting their testimony, they didn't know who Ben Robert Smith was. They just knew there was a big soldier who kicked their mate off a cliff. But they had this critical detail. He was wet from the waist down and covered in the sand of the Helmand River. You couldn't make that up.
Another soldier, who you named Nick Simpkin in your book, decided to approach Andrew Hastie, now the opposition's Home Affairs spokesperson, who's MP in the City Canning in WA. At that time, Andrew Hastie was a captain in the SAS. How worried was he already at that point about the SAS's behaviour, the SAS's attention to the rules of engagement in Afghanistan?
Hastie didn't have any specific hard smoking gun evidence of war crimes, executions, but he knew his colleagues in the SAS, or those under his command, he was an officer, were up to no good. I mean, they were drinking, fraternising, carrying on in a way that was breeding this culture of sort of lawlessness.
He called it pagan, actually, eventually. In the end, he said it was like some kind of strange Viking pagan warrior culture that had taken over parts of the SAS.
One thing that's well known about Andrew Hastie, to know him, you must know this, is that he's very religious. And so he does see things in biblical type terms. And in this case, he did see this absence of moral values, he would call them, perhaps Christian values, not just at the boozer, not just in training, but then out on the battlefield. And he was worried that lives were being taken too quickly.
He was also troubled about allegations of a practice called blooding. How did that work with people around Ben Robert Smith?
Blooding is the most awful of the things that we uncovered. You order a younger soldier on their first trip to get their first kill by executing either a prisoner or a civilian. Once they've done that, you own them. As in, Ben Robert Smith forever owns that soldier because he knows what they've done. They've done it on his orders and they're bound by this evil act. And people knew blooding was going on. I'll never forget a soldier, a veteran soldier, a tough bastard who had no problem shooting, say, a teenager with a radio in his mind. That was, it is permitted under the rules of war. That radio could be used to call in an ambush. If there's a threat to the SAS, this soldier would tell his men, get rid of that threat, whether they're 16 or 30. But he said, the practice of blooding, getting someone else to do your dirty work, to do an execution, if you want to execute somebody, do it yourself. Now, I do not agree with that terminology, that way of capturing what goes on. But in some respects, it really spoke to how far the SAS had gotten away from its values, but how ugly this practice was.
So you're hearing all these stories from SAS eyewitnesses, and in 2017, in October, you wrote a story on Ben Robert Smith's first major decoration for gallantry. Now, you approached him to get his side of the story. What response did you get to that?
Well, that story basically said nothing. It said very little. It raised a few concerns about Ben Robert Smith's conduct in terms of his treatment of other soldiers. It didn't call him an executioner or a war criminal. But the immediate response was one of fury. Sicked the lawyers onto us, didn't want to engage, ignored ultimately repeated requests for him to answer questions about what was going on. You know, if you do the wrong thing, I find in journalism people want to clear the air. They'll say, listen, what have you been told? I'll put the allegations to them. This is what's happened. When you put allegations to somebody and they run a million miles and lawyer up straight away and don't seek to correct the record, you start to know, geez, something might be amiss here. From that moment, Ben Robert Smith was engaged in a war against the truth coming out. He would use lawyers, aggressive lawyers. He would use PR merchants. He would use compliant journalists. And ultimately, he would use the most dirty mafia-style tactics you can imagine. You know, dirty tricks to get his opponents rated or smeared to make people fear that if they spoke to journalists about him. One bloke said to me in the SAS, I was worried about my dog getting poisoned, and he was serious.
That SAS soldier I mentioned earlier, Nick Simpkin, who had grave concerns about Ben Robert Smith's leadership, was raising his concerns. The Australian newspaper published an allegation about him after they received an anonymous email from someone calling himself blowerw2@gmail.com. Tell me about this allegation that was raised about this other SAS soldier.
It's really one of the most nuts twists and turns in this story. Robert Smith fears that this soldier knows what Robert Smith's done in the field. What does Robert Smith do to shut him up? He uses a series of cutouts, so middlemen, to conjure up a fake allegation that this soldier has machine guns stored at his house, and what's worse, this soldier might go and commit a public massacre, i.e. go and raid him. And the allegations go to the cops. They don't pay much interest because they probably smell a rat here. But then when the police don't act, and keep in mind, there's these cutouts Robert Smiths were using, they emailed no less than the Commissioner of the Federal Police of the day. They go to the Australian newspaper and a journalist gets the allegations and it is published that this soldier is accused of gun smuggling. It puts the police in a position where they have to act. This man's home is raided. His family is inside. Of course, there's no guns found. But what is the message? The unmistakable message to him is, you come after Ben Robert Smith, he's going to come after you. And he did. And, he would have got away with it if not for the great unravelling that later occurs.
February 2018, you and Chris Masters went to Perth to try and speak with members of Ben Robert Smith's patrol team. What did the few who agreed to speak with you tell you about the culture of the SAS at the time?
They talked about a Sikh culture. But keep in mind, these were men who, by talking about this Sikh culture where there was this desire to kill as many people on the battlefield as possible, not to further the outcome or the interest of the Australian Army and the greater coalition there, but to get your own kill count up, to get your own body count up. This Sikh culture, which, out of control, could lead to executions, did lead to executions, could lead to torture, did lead to torture, mistreatment of Afghan civilians and prisoners. They spoke about that, but the fact that they spoke about that says that there was this duality in the SAS. There were men with great moral consciences doing the right thing, fighting for what they knew was right, versus this clique. And it was a small clique of men who were doing the wrong thing. And one of the good guys described it in the most simple of terms. He said to me, he called it doing a righty. Doing a righty, doing the right thing. That is such a simple way of describing doing what is morally courageous and proper, which is a very hard thing when your colleagues are fighting with you in a war and they're doing a wrongy.
You mentioned the kill count. How much pressure was there on serving SAS men to have a high kill count?
This is where you've got to look at responsibility for what went wrong all the way up the chain of command and ultimately to government.
Because, kill count is really one of the most moth-eaten, stupid ideas about the conduct of warfare. The point, if you're involved in a war, is to win or prevail against the enemy. But, I don't know, at some point a manager comes in and looks at this kind of metric of kill count. It's like in Vietnam or in World War I, we're doing well because we killed X number of people. And it seems the point is to win, not to necessarily to kill.
Well, if you're killing the bad guys, aid the victory, that's a great thing. In this case, though, the wheels have fallen off. Our longest war wasn't being resolved in any way looking like a victory. So the only measure of tangible success, and of course it wasn't success, was this kill count. All right, we're losing the broader war, but we killed 3 people today, 3 Taliban. We killed four Taliban on Tuesday. And at some point it began to morph into, we didn't kill 4 Taliban, we just killed 4. And at some point soldiers began to just build up their own kill count for their own pleasure. And that's where things got terribly, terribly sick. And the madness of this is not only were civilians, prisoners, unarmed people being murdered, it's that you kill a civilian, you create a whole new Taliban fighting force. Yeah. Everyone who's related to that person from that point on hates the Australians and will do whatever they can to get revenge. You make it harder for your own fellow soldiers to be safe.
There's a lot of hatred for the Taliban amongst ordinary Afghans. We know this. And you start executing civilians and you lose your moral authority over the people you're supposed to be trying to help.
An SAS soldier said to me, it stuck in my head, he said, Nick, we are not the Taliban. But some of our soldiers were at their level when they began to do what the Taliban would do, which is to execute people, to disregard the laws of war, but disregard basic moral conduct.
And so what effect was this psychopathic behaviour having on their morale as a fighting force?
Well, someone in the Defence Force said, it was like you had many, many great good soldiers doing brave things, and then there was like a little bikie gang embedded in there who were roving the land committing executions. Justice Brereton, in his final report, it was all blacked out, classified, but what wasn't classified was a description, the worst conduct possibly in the history of the Australian Armed Services. And what he was referring to was that band of marauders, that little bikie gang, executing and murdering to get their own kill counts up.
ABC journalist Mark Willisey, when I spoke to him about his investigations into the SAS, said there was a culture in the barracks in Perth where the SAS men had succeeded in intimidating their officers, and the officers were having a lot of trouble exerting proper authority and oversight over these men. Did you see examples of that too?
That is true. That did happen in respect of some officers. There was too much power vested in senior soldiers who'd been there a long time. But there were some good officers who were diligent, who did stand up and do the right thing and then call it out when things went wrong. And we can't forget those. And there were weak officers. They weren't bullied or pushed around by men under their command. They were fanboys. They were too keen to suck up to your Ben Roberts-Smiths. And it's those officers, I think, who need to be scrutinised. What is clear is there was an absolute breakdown in the chain of command, in the proper oversight, and the officers didn't do the job that they had to do.
You'd heard those allegations that he'd kicked an Afghan civilian off a cliff and then ordered him to be shot. How did you go about finding the identity of the man who later turned out to be Ali Jan?
It was too dangerous to go to Afghanistan at the time, and we needed to get there to verify as best we could. We found a really terrific Afghan reporter, fixer. There's many Afghans who've helped Western journalists uncover the truth of what was happening in Afghanistan. He was one of those. And he went digging down south where it was very dangerous and really critically told him very few details. I mean, I didn't want to implant in his mind any ideas of what might have happened. But he came back with this crazy story of a man kicked off a cliff. And this man was Ali Jan, and this is who he was, and this was his wife's name and his relative's name. And these are witnesses. These are people who may have seen something. And, of course, we gave him the next task, track down those witnesses.
So then in June 2018, you and Chris Masters published these war crimes allegations in The Age and in the Sydney Morning Herald. You must have had to take a big, deep breath before you did this, because this is a man who's being upheld as a war hero. He's got a fan in Brendan Nelson, who was former Defence Minister and Director of the Australian War Memorial. He's certainly got Kerry Stokes, the owner of the Seven Network, behind him as well. Were you, I don't know, when you prepare yourself to publish these things, do you sort of batten down the hatches and wait for the storm to hit? It
wasn't a deep breath. It was, a months-long sort of, oh my God, we've found this. The facts seem to stack up, but are we right? And every moment doubting, second-guessing ourselves, because the consequence of being wrong would be disastrous. One of my bosses, James Chessel, told me later, he said, I didn't tell me at the time because he felt like it would have put too much pressure on me, but he said, if we stuff this up, the future of the mastheads, The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald could be in peril. It's so costly and reputationally damaging it would have been. So we spent literally months fact-checking and building and working with lawyers to make sure that we were right. And we thought, you know what, if we're right, there is no way he's going to sue because he knows we're right. Of course, how wrong we were in that respect.
What kind of conversations did you hear Ben Roberts-Smith was having with members of his own regiment at that time?
One of the crazy things was people so disliked Roberts-Smith that they'd sometimes tape record him when they met him or spoke to him. And we heard those tapes. I heard a number of tapes of him talking about me and Chris. And I won't swear on air, but, I'm going to effing destroy these guys. How dare they come after me? It became a very intensely personal thing for him that he would not just humiliate us and use the court system and every tactic he could to show that what we had written was false, but he would destroy us. He would bring us down. 2020,
you presented a big story on 60 Minutes about a raid on a compound in Afghanistan. It was given the name Whiskey 108. It had taken place on Easter Sunday way back in 2009. What was Ben Roberts-Smith's version of events, of what happened that day on the raid on Whiskey 108?
His version was that they'd assaulted this compound. The compound had been bombed. The SAS come in. They find two men hiding in a tunnel. These are likely insurgents. They take the men out to kill them, an act of great soldiering. But the problem was no one else saw it like that. Others on the ground that day in the SAS, they saw Ben Roberts-Smith machine gun a prisoner, unarmed, to death. And they saw Robert Smith and a second soldier order a third soldier to execute a second prisoner. At that point in time, they are prisoners of war. They are protected by the rules of armed war. You can't execute prisoners. But both men, according to SAS testimony, were executed. Robert Smith says, no, these men were insurgents attacking us from the outside. The problem with that story was that not only did no other soldier witness this incredible feat of soldiering Robert Smith said he was involved in, but many other soldiers witnessed the executions, and those soldiers testified on oath and said in great detail what had happened, truly happened that day. The ugly detail that we uncovered in that story was the guy that Ben Robert Smith machine gun had a plastic prosthetic leg. And that prosthetic leg was removed. It was taken back to SAS headquarters. It was cleaned and you'd tip beer in it, these soldiers, and they would swig beer out of it, the biggest beer drinking vessel in Afghanistan. And there's a photo that we uncovered. And it really says it all about how sick things got, where it's a fancy dress party, the leg's being used to swig beer. And in one shot, not only is that happening, but one of Ben Robert Smith's closest mates is dressed in a Ku Klux Klan outfit, the white supremacist outfit with the hood, and he's holding a burning cross in a place like Afghanistan.
What did other soldiers tell you about that, drinking from the prosthetic leg? Like, was this kind of expected of you to swig from this if you're going to be one of the boys, that kind of thing?
There was a black humour about it all.
There's always a bit of coercion behind those sorts of things, though, isn't there? A kind of a moral coercion, like if you're going to be one of us, you better have a swig from this, so we're all complicit in this ghastly thing.
Listen, it's an ugly thing. It's a black, ugly thing in hindsight. I don't judge those soldiers under a huge amount of pressure, but, let's keep it relative. The issue is that leg, plastic leg, came from a man who was machine gunned to death while unarmed, while a prisoner by Ben Robert Smith, knowing the leg came from him. And it was almost in drinking from that leg, as Ben Robert Smith did do. He knew he executed the guy. Drinking from it, for him, geez, that was sick. And you know what? He lied about it. He lied about it in court. His poor barristers said to the court, how dare Ben Robert Smith be accused of drinking from that leg? Disgusting. Turns out there's a video of him drinking from that leg.
As these allegations are coming to light, the Australian Federal Police launched its own investigation under conditions of tight secrecy as a covert investigation. Why did they think there was a necessity for secrecy in this investigation?
Well, the only hope in hell the AFP had of nailing Ben Robert Smith was tapping his phones, covert, secret tools that the police used to gain evidence, because, the dead bodies were over in Afghanistan. They couldn't find the bodies, as you would in some murder cases. The fact that it took place during a war and combat in this far-flung place made the investigation so hard. So phone taps, critical tool. Ben Robert Smith did not know that the AFP were tapping his phone, till of course he did.
How did he find out the AFP was tapping his phone?
Well, a former Federal Police Commissioner, McKenzie, inadvertently and very foolishly tipped off Ben Robert Smith that the AFP were circling him. And that was all Ben Robert Smith needed to know to start to change up his routine to make the police job so much harder.
You said former Federal Police Commissioner McKenzie. How did he know the AFP was investigating Ben Robert Smith?
That's still a very murky area. I do remember I was on family holidays at Magnetic Island, standing in the Bering sun, and my phone rings and it's Kelty's number. He wasn't a frequent caller, but I knew him, and he told me, hey, I've met with Ben Robert Smith and I've told him the AFP is interested in him. And I remember thinking, what the beep? Like, I remember saying to Kelty, what have you done, Mick? What's going on? Why would you tell? And how did you know? And he told me he'd been told by a senior AFP officer that the AFP had referrals, was engaged in the process of beginning an investigation into Ben Robert Smith. Whoever told him that shouldn't have. He was leaked very secret information. We don't really know who told him. We can guess, but we don't know. But that information should never have left the AFP. It should never have landed with Mick Kelty. And what, of course, should never have happened is Mick Kelty should never have told Ben Robert Smith.
How did Ben Roberts-Smith's behaviour change after he was given the heads up that his phone was being tapped?
Well, he went and got burner phones. These are phones in fake names or names other than his own. He used encrypted applications to communicate. He did his business face-to-face. There's a great story, which I've no doubt is true, of him meeting one of his accomplices on the ocean edge in Western Australia and them waiting out in their togs to make sure that this guy wasn't wearing a wire. Ben Roberts-Smith knew he was a man under investigation, under police secret siege, and he would do everything he could, and he did, to circumvent that police probe.
At this time, Ben Roberts-Smith tried to either destroy or conceal incriminating evidence in his own backyard. Tell me how he did that.
Well, he got a shovel and went digging and put a pink children's lunchbox, which his kids used to probably pack their lunch and go to school. He put 6 USBs in that lunchbox and he buried it. But, he made a very, very bad mistake. And I think that mistake was underestimating the intelligence and resolve of his then wife, soon-to-be former wife. Because she saw this weird thing, this bloke out there digging away, and in time, the curious wife, not trusting Roberts-Smith for good reason, would go and make her own inquiries and get her own shovel and start digging. And one muggy morning, she hits this plastic edge and she pushes her hand through that dirt and comes up with this box, pink children's lunchbox with 6 USBs. And on those USBs is evidence, is photos of people who have likely been executed, is photos of men drinking from that prosthetic leg. Important, critical evidence to help us win this defamation case. And to her credit, Ben Roberts-Smith's now ex-wife, Emma Roberts, the police are involved, and ultimately she testifies in court very, very bravely about what she found. And it's a critical turning point in the case.
November 2020. There's all these parallel lines running of investigation from Justice Brereton, from the Federal Police, to your own investigations through the Fairfax papers. But in 2020, the Brereton report was delivered. Justice Brereton delivered his report and handed it to General Angus Campbell, who said in a media conference that Justice Brereton had uncovered credible evidence that 39 Afghan people had been murdered by Australian Special Forces. Was Ben Roberts-Smith or anyone else named in that report?
No one was named, but he effectively added himself. He released a statement attacking that inquiry, and everybody knew that he was good for some of those alleged murders that were described within it. There is no doubt that that inquiry includes murders that were part of our court case. And there is no doubt that inquiry is informing the ongoing investigations into Ben Roberts-Smith that continue as we speak here today.
Defamation case against you and Chris and Fairfax Media is launched by lawyers working on behalf of Ben Roberts-Smith. It's going to the federal court. Now, it's a civil case. They're suing you for defamation. So what's the obligation on you then as a defendant in this case in order to defend yourself successfully?
Our task is to prove the truth of the allegation. Effectively, we have to present a hugely difficult case that Ben Roberts-Smith did execute this person at this time by this means. And we need to summon the admissible evidence to do so, i.e. SAS witnesses. And it's one thing for an SAS person to whisper to their mate about something terrible that upsets them. A whole other thing for them to get in the stand on oath and be stared down by Ben Roberts-Smith, as he did with every one of those witnesses of ours, as they, under cross-examination, recount in exacting detail how Ali Jan was kicked off that cliff and how he was executed at the bottom of that cliff and how observing that has stayed with them every day and every night of their life.
So as the defendants in this case, in a civil case, it's all weighed on the balance of probabilities rather than the test of truth being something beyond reasonable doubt like it would in a criminal trial. That's right, isn't it?
The standard is called the Briginshaw principle or test is applied. It is, to put it simply, balance of probabilities means more likely than not. That's in normal life, that's 51 to 49, let's say. However, in a court case and applying the Briginshaw test, given how grave the allegations were, we're calling Australia's most famous decorated soldier a war criminal. It's something much greater than that. What it is up to the judges and the court to decide. But ultimately, the evidence we bring to the court has to be so compelling for the judge to find that the allegation is borne out.
How confident that you would win the case?
Well, not confident at all, because getting those witnesses to court was a huge ordeal. Our most important witness was blowing in the wind up until 5 minutes to midnight. The first time we called this witness, he was too unwell, too mentally stressed to testify. At that point, our case was collapsing. At that point, we were done for.
Then villagers came forward from Darwan or from that area in Afghanistan to testify via video link on what happened to Ali Jan. What did they say?
We were racing to get the witnesses to Australia, get them visas, clearance, etc., which is extremely difficult, as the Taliban is racing towards Kabul to take over the capital and kick out the government.
Right, so all this is going on while that's happening.
Oh, it's extraordinary. Right. And our witnesses are holed up in a safe house in Kabul. We know that the Taliban may view their help of a Western journalist as a death penalty crime. So we're saying to the judge in the federal court, can we use video link because this might all be too late? Of course, Robert Smith's team is saying, no, they need to come here knowing they never probably would make it to Australia. The judge, Basanko, says, no, let them testify. This is important evidence. We'll go via video link. We have a translator in Canada, an expert translator, the only guy we could find around the world. Our witnesses in Kabul in a safe location, and we're sitting in the court watching them pipe down the line. And we were so worried about the evidence, given the language and cultural difficulties and the huge exacting awfulness of cross-examination, but damn, they were good. They spoke with clarity and precision about what they saw and when, and with conviction. And there's a great moment in the case where they're getting abused and attacked. One of the Afghan witnesses who had a presence about him. He was an ordinary old farmer. He had seen what had happened, and he was accused of being a liar, repeatedly by Ben Robert Smith's barrister. He was case finished for that day. The judge says, you can go again, away, sir, you're over. He doesn't quite realise it's over, and this old Afghan man starts to say down the court video, how dare you accuse me of being a liar? Because I can tell you, if it was the Taliban who killed Ali Jan, or the Australians who killed Ali Jan, or the Americans, I would tell the truth about either one. I'd tell the truth, and this is the truth. And there was a real power to what he said, even though it wasn't evidence.
How about the eyewitnesses from the SAS who gave testimony? What was their cross-examination like?
It was harrowing, and it was really upsetting to see Arthur Moses, SC, one of the senior barristers and well-known barristers on the Sydney bar, under instructions from his client, rip into our soldiers.
Like saying what about them?
You are mentally, not only are you a liar over and over again, but you're mentally unwell and you've been scarred. He said to one of our SAS witnesses, who was a terrific soldier, he said to this medic, SAS medic, oh, well, you've seen some dead people and that's made you so mentally stressed that you don't know a left from right. And, I mean, after he testified and was believed by the judges, I must say, he called me this SAS medic, and he was crying on the phone. This is the guy who served his country with bravery, put himself on the line. He found that cross-examination more harrowing than going to war. And to hear this man sobbing on the phone, to me, it will stay with me for a long, long time.
What was your cross-examination like in the stand?
Well, it was really awful, I must say. Two days, you're trapped like a deer in headlights.
And what was put to you about your motivations?
Everything under the sun, that you're a liar, that you're a scumbag, that you're prepared to lie on oath. I mean, it's part of the process. But yeah, it is, people say enduring cross-examination is one of the hardest things that you can do in life, and I can attest to that. Of course, there's nothing like going to war, but consider this. Many of the SAS soldiers who testified on our behalf would later say that going to war was easier than being cross-examined because they break you down mentally in the box. You know, the one thing, though, that kept me hanging in there and kept our witnesses hanging in there was the truth, that North Star. You know, even if we get smeared, and it wasn't just being cross-examined, it was having the Daily Telegraph or other news limited outlets, you know, smear our witnesses or smear us repeatedly, you know, waking up and seeing your name in the paper over and over again. This PR attack, this legal attack, it is relentless and never-ending, but through that, you know, the truth will come out, the truth will out.
Throughout this, media proprietor Kerry Stokes was unwavering in his support for Ben Robert Smith, as were elements of News Limited, the Daily Telegraph and in the Australian newspaper. Despite all these rising allegations that were confirmed by multiple eyewitnesses, both within the SAS and within the civilians in Afghanistan, what do you make of this mindset that is like my side right or wrong, it seems to be, or no matter what? Is it some kind of strange loyalty? What do you make of that psychology as best you can, Nick?
Elements of this were a culture war. So some journalists, and Kerry Stokes to some extent, I think, viewed this as a culture war, as in the progressive media, how dare they judge our soldiers in any circumstance. But there came a point where the evidence that Ben Robert-Smith had executed civilians and prisoners became so overwhelming that you looked at that culture war and said, well, sure, fight your war, but can you address the evidence? And those fighting that culture war never did. And to this day, I think the most disgusting thing about what Kerry Stokes did and what some elements of the media did was it wasn't about denigrating the journalism or what we did. It was in backing Ben Robert-Smith, they were heaping scorn and denigrating those soldiers who had the moral courage, having fought for their country, to stand up and say, I saw Ben Robert-Smith execute someone, and that is not what we do as an Australian soldier. How can their accounts be so awfully dismissed and attacked by elements of our media?
You know, at the outset of this investigation, I suppose you might have thought you'd be up against the quote-unquote defence establishment, which is quite famously very protective and a bit secretive and unwilling to admit any kind of error. That's not what happened at all. It seemed like you were up against other sections of the media that considered you a rival or an impertinence. That must have been quite surprising for you.
To this day, it's really disappointing. I mean, it's one of the difficult things because we're all in this difficult media environment together, and yet some people seem to, the idea of journalism, as Chris Masters said, is holding truth to power. But what these guys in the media were doing were holding power to truth. They were backing the billionaire in Kerry Stokes and the false war hero narrative for their cultural reasons, for their commercial reasons, and for other reasons that escape me. But ultimately, you know what? The good news is the public saw through it. The majority of people care about the truth.
You know, there's that famous line in the movie Apocalypse Now where Colonel Willard says, I'm going after Colonel Kurtz, who's gone upriver and he's committing war crimes or he's using unusual and illegal methods and he's went illegal. He says it's like handing out speeding tickets at the Indy 500. And I think there was a defence of Ben Robert-Smith which said, well, the stuff happens in the fog of war. What's your view on that?
Well, no less than Brendan Nelson, our former Defence Minister, Ben Robert-Smith's biggest backer and currently the executive chairman of a large arms company, said just that. How dare Chris Masters and Nick McKenzie, how dare they judge Ben Robert-Smith and what he did in war or judge any Australian soldier? And the answer to that is so simple. It's not us judging. It is soldiers who fought in Afghanistan who are deeply uncomfortable with what Ben Robert-Smith did. This is not about what journalism says and what journalists think. It's about what the soldiers themselves saw, what repulsed them, and what they ultimately fought for with great moral courage. They fought for what was right.
Including former SAS Captain Andrew Hastie, who stood up in court to give his own testimony. What did he say in court?
I think people don't understand how brave Hastie was, because it's not just the pressure of his veteran comrades, some of whom would have wished he just stayed quiet, but he's a conservative, Hastie, and there are many conservative politicians who'd rather this story never be told. And yet he stood up against all of that to say, A, what the truth was, and B, for him it was a moral cleansing. Unless this comes out as ugly as it is, we will not restore the reputation of our most respected and elite fighting force. For him, it was the Anzac legacy that was at stake here. And he says, I think really powerfully, well, let's build on that great Anzac legacy. Let's make it also about truth tellers and those with moral conviction who do what is right in war.
2023, Judge Buzanko was ready to deliver his finding. What do you remember of that day in court?
I remember waking up at 4 a.m. or whatever and going for a run. I'm from Melbourne, but I was staying in this little shitbox in Sydney near Bondi, and I ran across the ocean. This amazing rainbow lit up the sky, and I dived actually into the ocean and just prayed. I'm not religious either, but geez, did I pray that we'd win. And then going into court and not knowing whether we'd won. We knew we'd marshalled great evidence in there, but then to hear Justice Buzanko, I mean, it was a little bit like that great scene in The Castle. Is Justice Buzanko is being very technical in his descriptions, and I'm saying to Chris Masters, what is it, have we won? But it became very clear quickly that we had indeed won. I think it was just that rush of emotion and knowing that this was so important for all those soldiers that helped us, and for Emma Roberts, who'd stood up and done the right thing, and for others who cared for the truth, and for the Australian public ultimately to know what happened in war. There was so much on the line, and it was one of the most greatest moments of relief and emotional outpourings of my life. And not only did Justice Bosanko find that, but then 3 judges of the full bench of the Federal Court and the High Court of Australia said, no, this stands. So 11 judges, senior judges, have looked at this and said the evidence is so utterly compelling. And the full bench of the Federal Court described something. They said not often is it that a murder is witnessed by multiple witnesses, as it was in the case of Whiskey 108.
So the court found that you'd successfully made your defence that Ben Roberts-Smith had committed murder while in Afghanistan. Is he now facing criminal charges?
He is not facing criminal charges. I think he will. The Office of the Special Investigator, the special body, has been probing him behind the scenes. It's very secretive for 3+ years. Every indication from my research is that he'll be charged around the end of the year, maybe shortly afterwards. Then it will be up to a jury to weigh the evidence, the criminal standard, to see if he's guilty or not. But I think the people of Afghanistan, I think Ali Jan's family deserve that justice.
You write that you're the son of a Polish-Jewish migrant to Australia, someone who lost the largest part of his family during the Holocaust. I wonder if that's something that's in the back of your mind when you want to pursue as an investigative journalist alleged war crimes like the ones put to Ben Roberts-Smith.
It burns in you, of course it does. Of course what the Nazis did was utterly beyond description, and to be the relative of family who were killed in the Holocaust is part of who I am. But we must apply the same standards to those who wear our uniform. A war crime is a war crime, and there is a person on the end of that, even if they're a Polish Jew, like my family was, or even if they're an Afghan farmer, like Ali Jan was. Human life is precious. Civilians don't deserve to be executed, and whoever does the trigger pulling should be held to account. And if we let it go, if we look the other way, then what are we as a society? What are we fighting for in war?
Nick, it's been amazing speaking with you. Thank you for sharing your story today.
Great to be with you, thanks.
Nick McKenzie's book is called Crossing the Line.
This is Conversations with Richard Fidler. You can find more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app.
Today's conversation with Nick McKenzie was made on the lands of the Gadigal people. Producer was Mickey Morris. Executive producer is Nicola Harrison. I'm Richard Fidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Fidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.